Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here. It's especially cool to. So I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and it's really cool to be here in an international setting and see everyone talking about JavaScript. Sometimes when you're in the San Francisco Bay, it feels like all tech is localized there, which is not true. So it's cool to be here. My talk is the exact opposite of Sada's talk, so it's pretty cool to have the opposing viewpoints at the same conference. Somewhere in her talk, she said something like she has clients that are still using Redux, but they want to use GraphQL, and her question was why. That's what this is about. Because I'm also using GraphQL and went from Apollo client back to Redux. So first, let's get some pleasantries out of the way. A little about me. My name is Max Millington. I'm an engineer working at PayPal. Hence the swag. I work primarily in JavaScript, and I specialize in React in building new products. I specifically wanted to mention that I build new products as opposed to open source or tooling, because I find that product engineers, especially ones who work on new products, approach software in a different way, and we have different priorities. And I imagine a lot of you are working on new products and are working on products and new products, and would appreciate the insight. There's a greater emphasis on clarity. You know, how's the next guy going to read this? And there's less an emphasis on philosophical purity, and our code is grosser, as the devs say. But we've got deadlines to meet, products to build. And we value simplicity and durability. Accordingly, the tools we use become less desirable if they're really, really clever, which is something I'll talk about here. Something that saves me lines of code and a little bit of time up front seems really attractive. But if ultimately we don't understand what's going on, and there's a real possibility that when the first unforeseen problem arises, we could be in trouble. Furthermore, in my experience, if you have like a cool, clever new product, it's chances are it's built for like one really, really specific, great use case. But it's not necessarily, especially if it's new, it hasn't necessarily taken into all the edge cases. And at PayPal, I've got millions of merchants to deal with, hundreds of millions of consumers, so I deal with a lot of edge cases. Which is why so many of our tools are actually built internally, which is a blessing and a curse. So let's talk a little bit about the state of the front-end ecosystem. This is piggybacking a little bit on what Kitso had to say. JavaScript developers, particularly us front-end developers, we have a lot. We constantly have to re-examine the technology and tooling we use. This is both a blessing and a curse. It's a potential pitfall, because on the one hand, I've never met a software engineer who isn't interested in learning new things, making their applications more efficient, and expanding their knowledge. But on the other hand, I think everyone in this room has probably been burned by adopting the cool, hot new tool, only to find out that it's a tech debt generating nightmare later on. So my team at PayPal recently experienced something like this, which is what I'm going to share with you. We started a brand new product. And it's always, especially at a big company, you don't get to start new products too often. So we were really excited. We were like, okay, we start from scratch. We get to completely take a look at what sort of technologies we were going to use and what shape our repository would take. So at PayPal, we were already big fans of React, and everyone on the team wanted to use React. So that wasn't really a question. We wanted to, so we were going to continue to using it. And we also have some teams at PayPal investing really heavily in GraphQL. And my team was really excited about the prospect of using it and getting our hands dirty with GraphQL. So we eagerly went down the rabbit hole, familiarizing ourselves with the surrounding ecosystem and its community. So we started using GraphQL. We're still using it today. And naturally, we started to think about state management. And we were all hesitant about Redux, kind of like Kitso mentioned. There's a lot of people are starting to question, like, oh, I should never use Redux at all. And a lot of us were kind of feeling like that. And we read a great blog post by Peggy Races, who works for the Apollo team. And then I went to an Apollo conference in San Francisco, met with all of them, talked with them. And we began to question out whether or not we really needed Redux in our app. I mean, Redux's downsides are well known. There's lots of repeat boilerplate. It's a high barrier to entry. It's confusing for a lot of developers. And I think for me personally, my biggest problem is there's a constant question of the best way to organize your state and not get like a big ballooned out of control state tree. And then while I was actually writing this talk, someone sent me this tweet. This is from Andrew Clark. He's one of the co-creators of Redux. So I'm writing this talk, and I'm like, actually, Redux is pretty good. And the co-creator himself is like, oh, this thing is stupid. Like, it would be great if we could just get rid of it and use some of the ecosystem stuff, put it on React itself. So point taken, Andrew. And let's continue. So I'd already spent a good deal of time talking about Apollo Client, so I'm not going to spend too much time on it. But I just wanted to bring up an example real quick and talk about it more generally as opposed to going into details. It's not really essential for the point of my talk, but you could see why something like this would be really, really attractive. So we have a stateless functional component here with this query component imported from React Apollo, and you can see what's happening. Like Apollo client and Apollo link state, they take care of things like loading, error, and data. You just destructure the object that you get back. That you can see how this would save you a lot of repetitive time. I mean, everyone's got like a bunch, probably handling their loading and error states in Redux, and it's repetitive. And most importantly, when things are like repetitive, there's a high probability of human error. I mean, that's been my experience as well. So this was pretty great, and we dove in headfirst, started using it, and we're enjoying it. But we soon began to second guess our choice. We found that there were some limitations and peculiarities about Apollo Client that we didn't like. And also we found ourselves missing many of what I consider to be the core features of Redux. And in the process, found ourselves significantly reappreciating Redux and how great it is. So first, a little bit of note about what this talk is and what this talk isn't. So even though we're leaving Apollo Client, I don't want to say Apollo Client's not good. I actually really like it a lot. I really like the Apollo team. I really enjoyed meeting with them and working with them. Similarly, it's not to say that Redux is perfect. There's plenty of issues with Redux. If you have a big app or you work for a big company and you've just got a myriad of events firing all over the place and you're on event overload, I'm not going to address that in this talk, although I've got opinions on it. So if you want to talk about it later, we can talk about it. So rather, the point is that in reevaluating Redux and what we want from our state management on my team, I think we found some trivial reasons which were like, okay, we need to get moving fast and there's some things that we liked about Redux, but we also we began to think of why has it been so popular? Why has it been like the de facto state management system for the past 3 or 4 years? Is it just because the community was so good? And we really began to think about it more deeply. And so I think that we came to a realization, which is what I'm going to share. So the first, I'm going to point out a couple of trivial reasons, and then I'm going to point out what, in my opinion, is the real value prop of Redux, which is that the simple functional programming pattern that underlies the library is really, really powerful. So let's go back to this tweet real quick. So Andrew himself, even though he says Redux is stupid, he himself points out just how good the dev tools are and how good the community is. This isn't a trivial thing. Well, I mean, it's superficial, but it's an important thing. So we found ourselves really reliant on the dev tools and the Redux debugger, time traveling, things like that, and the large quantity and quality of middleware available at the library. This in part was a function of the time that I started using Apollo Client. It was just very, very young and it just wasn't there. And Redux has really benefited from being, like I mentioned, the de facto state management system for the past few years. So, and the community has rewarded it accordingly. So if you're thinking about moving away from Redux, think about how much you rely on maybe the time traveling or the debugger and whether or not you want to lose them. Another thing is something that we didn't really adequately estimate is even though we're heavily investing in GraphQL, my team's a fan. So far, it's been successful. Nevertheless, the future of GraphQL at PayPal and on my team specifically is far from certain. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know where it's going to be a year from now. For all I know, we may have to go all the way back to REST endpoints, or we may have to have some RESTful APIs and mix them with GraphQL. And so there's a clear benefit to something like Redux, which intentionally does not care about any of this. You could just use it regardless. And we certainly didn't want to use some combination. Like we didn't want to use Apollo Client and Apollo Client link state for our GraphQL and then Redux for our REST endpoints. We wanted to use just one thing. And Sarah also mentioned how strange it was for a while doing server-side rendering with Apollo Client. That was also an issue at the time. So these are some superficial reasons, in my opinion. These trivial reasons in and of themselves might be good enough for most teams to just say, you know what, I'm not ready to transition over to Apollo Client, and I could still use GraphQL with Redux, but I really need the debugger. I really need some of these other things, and who knows, maybe I'll need to have some I'll need to support some REST endpoints, and Redux is just easier for that. However, as I mentioned, I think that there's something further, namely the functional programming pattern, which I'll discuss. But first, before I do that, I want to talk a little bit about approaching a problem like this and kind of what I learned from this process. So I'm going to go through kind of like an extreme example. This is Aristotle. I want someone to confirm that I may be the first JavaScript developer to talk about Aristotle at a JavaScript conference. I don't know if that's true or not, but anyway. So Aristotle had lots to say, and one thing about Aristotle that really stuck with me is the way that he approached discourse, and the way that he, in the manner of his inquiry. When examining a problem or a subject, he would always begin examining the opinions of others and diving deep into why they may have believed what they believed. And what was special about him is he was never dismissive. He took every opinion very seriously, even ones that were on the surface clearly false or clearly ridiculous. His hypothesis was that there's always something underneath, or else the person wouldn't hold the opinion. So for example, Aristotle spent a good deal of his career talking about change. What is the definition of change? How is change possible? And in doing so, he addressed two really ridiculous opinions. The first was that of Parmenides. He's the guy on the left. This is from the School of Athens, by the way, in Rome. So Parmenides held that change was impossible. Our perception of change is merely an error of opinion. And what you experience is all an illusion. And so this is a ridiculous opinion. Clearly change exists, but trust me, the Greeks had actually a hard time refuting his arguments, and he had a whole cult devoted to him. Zeno of Zeno's paradoxes was a follower of this guy. The second ridiculous opinion was that of Heraclitus. He's the guy on the right. And he said he spoke in poems. He says, no man can step in the same river twice. And what he means is that there's no identity. Everything's in a state of flux. So you are not the same you were 5 minutes ago, and you won't be the same you 5 minutes from now. You'll be a completely different thing. I think it's fair to say that these are pretty ridiculous, and no one would really take these seriously. It's obvious that if you step in the Mississippi River, it's still the same Mississippi River, but there's something different about it. And then, moreover, it's obvious that change happens. Like, my hands are moving, the place is changing. However, why not take these opinions seriously? Aristotle did, and he used these as the starting point to build his own system of physics and philosophy. And when I was younger, this had a really profound effect on me, because if Aristotle could take something pretty ridiculous like this seriously, why can't I take something that's not ridiculous seriously and learn from it? And that's kind of what I'm worried about with a lot of the criticisms of Redux. It seems like, oh, Redux has a lot of boilerplate. It's really annoying. Let's just get rid of it. And I feel like we have we run the risk of missing what's really good about it without taking it really seriously and looking what's underneath it. And by the way, Redux is not insane, so it's not as crazy as these opinions. We're not talking about physics, we're talking about just software development. I've never really met an insane opinion, although I used to be a Rails dev, and when you tell the Rails devs, equivalent to what Sarah was saying, that you have to go to 4 different files just to get your stuff and display it on the page, what do you think the reaction was? The reaction was that that's insane. So, as I stated before, the talk is not meant to convince everyone just to use Redux. In fact, like I said, a lot of the criticism is justified. In fact, it would be great for maybe a new library to kind of use the core of Redux and address some of those criticisms. And in fact, it would even be better if it was just built into React. We could talk about that after some time. But just because there's one less than perfect aspect of it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try to figure out what's great about it. Redux has been around for a while, and it wouldn't be around for a while if it didn't have a good reason. And I think the same is true for React. This is the same app that Michael had in his talk. So if you remember, just a few short years ago, it was a real gamble choosing what framework you were going to use. And if you chose the wrong one, it was a real possibility that you would have really costly rewrites or painful difficulties in hiring. I've got, anyone in the San Francisco Bay Area that's still using Angular 1 has a really, really hard time hiring. Although it was really interesting what Kitsa said about the guy in Asia with following the Angular 1 market. But the job market, again, that's a superficial reason. I think that there's something underlying why React is so popular, and it's because it's so simple. This is the simplest React app, and we're in the React space are often criticized, oh, it's really hard to break in, really hard to get things going. I think that's mostly the fault of us on terms of teaching. Our tutorials and teaching could be better. But if you think about it, we get a lot of interns at PayPal, and I basically teach them a little bit about JSX and tell them, write me a function that returns the markup you want, and they can do it. I mean, there's a bunch of more complicated things, but like this itself is actually fairly simple and really powerful. It feels like you're writing ES6 JavaScript. And the same is true for Redux. Here we have the simple Redux reducer, and when boiled down, it's really just the dispatch of an action, the reducing of an immutable state object, and iterated over subscribers, and that's it. Everything else that people love to hate about Redux, map dispatch to props, the boilerplate, in my view, those are superfluous, and those can be addressed in a way without abandoning this pattern, which is really strong. So at PayPal, we have Doug Crockford, who's a well-known JavaScript developer. He's an employee, and we're lucky enough that he gives talks every once in a while on, how to approach JavaScript. And I would describe his views like this: the good parts of JavaScript are really, really good, and make it the most powerful language. And the bad parts are really, really bad, and avoid them like the plague. And the best part about JavaScript is perhaps the functional programming pattern, which JavaScript is really well equipped for. So let's talk just a brief bit about functional programming. Functional programming is the process of building software by composing pure functions, avoiding mutable data, and avoiding side effects. Pure functions are functions which, given the same inputs, always return the same output and have no side effects. An immutable state object, or an immutable object, excuse me, is an object that can't be modified after it's created. Immutability is a central concept of functional programming because without it, the data flow in your program is lossy, state history is abandoned, and bugs can creep into your code. Functional programming is a programming paradigm, meaning that it's a way of thinking about software development. It's based on some fundamental principles. Functional code tends to be more concise, more predictable, and critically easier to test. That's really important to me. And Orvieto in his talk was talking about how easy it is to test reducer functions. That's a really big deal. The fact that your changes in states are extraordinarily easy to test. The whole goal that I'm trying to achieve when I write applications is not cleverness or elegance, rather is to write a program that works well and is free of error. And the thesis is that programs that follow the functional paradigm are the most likely to be free of error. So this is what's going on in Redux. If we come back to Redux and look at what it essentially boils down to, we'll see that the pattern it implements is as relevant and powerful as ever. Redux is fundamentally built on the notion of an immutable state object and a pure side effect-free reducer function. And that's it. The middleware, API, tooling, all those things are extras that are some of these things we like, some of those things we love to hate. And those things can be addressed, but what we shouldn't do is throw the baby out with the bathwater and lose this pattern. When you choose a state management system, you're buying into a pattern. And Redux's pattern is really, really good, despite the criticisms about how complex the library is. This part is really, really simple. So let's compare this to what we saw before with Apollo Client, and I think you could probably think of what I don't like as much about this. We have what's often called a pure functional component, or sometimes they're called dumb components or functional components, whatever. And you'd think like, okay, those are clearly desirable because they're really easy to test, really side effect free, but is this one side effect free? It's kind of not. It's got this weird query component coming from somewhere, and it's doing something. I don't really see what's going on, and it kind of takes away from the purity of this function. So even though I really like the things like handling the loading error for me, I lose that functional pattern here, but it's not even obvious that I've lost it because I've still got a functional component. Whereas I just want to go back to Redux for a second. Like, look at this. I mean, this is just JavaScript. You have to go a while into Redux, including the source code, to find something that's not just like straight ahead JavaScript. There's not really anything weird about it. That's pretty powerful. So what to take away from this? I really hope that actually React incorporates something like this out of the box. And also implements like some of the better tooling that Redux has, because the truth of the matter is a library isn't really needed to follow the pattern I'm talking about. You could create a reducer function yourself and implement this pattern without using any library at all. But it's nice to have the library because we've got things like the time traveler and the debugger. It'd be nice to have something like that. But what we absolutely shouldn't sacrifice, in my opinion, is that there's the clarity of a simple pure reducer function and the immutable state object, and what that brings to our apps. And again, part of the reason why, part of the reason why React, in my opinion, has enjoyed a lot of success in the front-end community is because ever since, especially since ES6 syntax was introduced, building apps feels a lot like you're coding in JavaScript. And our intellectual effort is spent more on component architecture than it is learning about something that seems really foreign to the language. And therefore, it reads more like JavaScript. And my opinion is that Redux also, at least the core of it, reads just like JavaScript and is fairly straightforward. And we lose a lot by abandoning it. So when I started diving deeper into Redux, I not only came to reappreciate the library, but I also came away with a stronger sense of by what means I would judge a new technology that I would want to use with my team. I want to use libraries that not only clearly show me what's going on, but I also want to use ones that use the so-called good parts of JavaScript, namely solid functional programming principles. These are the ones that are going to be heavily favored by my team in the future. Thank you.